I'm texting now.
Oh, okay. I was just getting ready to. Okay.
And we should be live now.
Great, thank you, Erin. All right, we will call to order this afternoon's meeting of the Policy Review Committee. In attendance, we have Dr. Battle, Erin Tinklenberg, Tony Connor, Rachel Gorton, Lisa Ryder, and Jamie Kenny. We're also waiting for Sue Said to join us, and I'm sure she'll be with us shortly. I guess we'll start right off we're looking at policy 634, electronic technologies, acceptable use. And I guess we'll start, Dr. Battle, did you have anything that you wanted to say to introduce before we turn it over to Rachel?
This is a new policy that is replacing our current acceptable use policy. It was reviewed by a previous policy committee, and there was robust discussion and some changes and a reference that by the time we finished the next draft, it would be a new policy committee. So I'll turn it over to Rachel Gorton and she'll give some context. This is a long process to bring forward this policy.
Thank you, Dr. Battle. Good evening. I did write up just a little bit of a summary to kind of give some context to this policy, where we've been and kind of what we're proposing. So I'm just going to go ahead and read that first to kind of get us started. So policy 634 is intended to guide the what and the how as we make decisions and actions regarding electronic technologies in District 191. The policy is designed to provide a framework that helps us protect students from harmful content online and to provide students and staff with good access to digital content and support learning and our work. A key federal law that is driving our acceptable use policy is the Children's Internet Protection Act, or CIPA, which requires that any school district that receives the federal E-rate funding filters and blocks visual depictions that are obscene, contain child pornography, or material harmful to minors. The law also requires us to have in place an internet safety policy, which this is. You will see these elements in both the existing 524 policy and the proposed 634, and either of these policies fulfill the requirement for the internet safety policy per CIPA requirements. The shift from the existing policy 524, which is a student-only focus, to this proposed policy 634, which incorporates students and staff, is intended to address the complex and changing use of electronic technologies and to modernize and update language and concepts. This process was started at least 2 years ago as the need for a more comprehensive acceptable use policy, or AUP, as they're commonly referred to, was identified as a need. While much of that work occurred in previous years, a revised draft was brought to this policy committee in November of 2020. And that policy committee feedback was focused really on ensuring that the unique situations regarding students, staff, and guests were clarified specifically around the use of district resources such as Wi-Fi on personal devices versus district access and use of Wi-Fi and on district devices. The term electronic technologies is intended to encompass the district's network, devices, and resources. Since the Policy Review Committee has 3 new members and the proposed policy 634 is complex, the current draft is brought to you tonight as a first read of the policy. The policy outlines unacceptable uses, user notification requirements, specific policy areas for students, guests, and employees, as well as district web presence and activity, filtering, and liability. As I mentioned earlier, the acceptable use policy guides our decisions and actions when we set up our electronic systems, including filtering, permissions, and settings. As well, it defines required user notifications. Users who access district electronic technologies, including our Wi-Fi, Chromebooks, laptops, and other electronic technologies, accept and adhere to federal and state laws and district policies and requirements as a condition of use. So that gives kind of a context of this policy as a whole, because it is a pretty complex policy.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Before we dig into the details of the policy itself and kind of start looking at the language and questions we might have about that, I just wanted to open it up, Tony and Sue, if you have any broad or top line questions about either of these policies, or what we're looking at today.
Not at this time. I wasn't able, I read what the policy, well, what was on the website, the broad book, but I wasn't able to scroll all the way down. So I may have questions about the part I didn't get to read.
Got it. So Tony, when you, I've noticed when you're in board book, you have to actually click on the page if you're reviewing it in board book. If you're not down, if you download it, then you can just scroll through it as you normally would. But in board book, you actually have to click your cursor on that page and then you're able to scroll down.
Okay.
It's one of those wonderful hidden features.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know.
Yep. Sue, did you have any top line questions? Nope. All right. And welcome.
No, thank you for asking.
Okay. So I did have a couple of general questions about the policy. I understand. So Rachel, you said that either 634 or 524 is an acceptable use policy. Why was the decision made to change from the one to the other?
So I will provide the context that I know, because I wasn't involved when it first started. The decision was made when it first started to shift. I do know that there is a trend across almost all districts in Minnesota to be shifting from that student-only centered 524 to the 634, which is more comprehensive and encompasses not only students, but also employees as well as guests. So it's just kind of a more comprehensive look at the electronic technologies.
And yet at the same, and fellow board members, I'll also call out the fact that there is additional documentation that we all need to look at, and that goes back to November 10th. The last policy, the date on which the policy review committee, the previous committee, reviewed this policy, and there are some there's a different document with, well, it's the same policy, but with notes that will help guide our discussions. I guess the question is, back in November, Lisa was presenting, and now we have Rachel presenting. It would seem to me that Rachel, you've been working on this now for 2 years. Why would someone else be presenting a policy that you've been working on?
I started the policy, Director Alt, with regard to the 524 switching over to the 634 prior to Rachel being in the position she's in. And so as Aaron and Rachel and I were working on it, Rachel has a very firm handle on the tech side of it and the explanation and rationale behind things. So I suggested that was something that if she felt comfortable, she could take that and move it forward.
And when did you start working on it, Lisa?
Doug Johnson was still here at the time. This is quite some time in the making.
But it was Doug Johnson that brought forward the original internet acceptable use policy.
I don't know exactly where. I don't recall. Maybe Aaron. Oh, okay. Then maybe you know more. I don't know. I thought that was a question, but.
No, well, I mean, I basically the question of timing of when it's news to me based on what had been shared leading up to this meeting that anyone but Rachel had been working on this policy.
We've had a team of us working on this for some time. And as people have transitioned, that has shifted.
Okay. And the other, all right, so I guess, so it's the team's recommendation, Rachel, that moving to 634, even though the structure of the two policies is nearly identical. The recommendation is to go to the new policy as opposed to sticking with the old policy format.
Yeah, correct. And the reason for that is, when I've talked to colleagues in other districts, the reason for that is that there is so much overlap in many of the things that we would put into. So if we kept the 524 policy, then we would be adding another policy, but there's so much overlap in those that it doesn't make sense to have 2 separate or 3 separate if we're going to do for employees and for guests as well. And so the trend really across what I've seen across most districts is creating one comprehensive electronic technologies plan that can cover students, employees, and guests.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess the other question I have is, given that there were comments in the document, maybe this is a question for Teresa. There were comments that were included in the notes going back to November 10th. That is not the document that we're looking at today. So basically those staff comments have automatically been incorporated into the policy. Is that correct?
They are sorry.
Go ahead, Lisa. Sorry.
The comments that you're referring to are the November 10th notes that I spoke or I wrote as people were speaking to the policy. And so many of those comments are suggestions from.
I think she's referring to what's posted in November 10th, Lisa.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what Rachel was going to answer. What we posted as board book materials November 10th. Not our note taking from the policy committee that night. Go ahead, Rachel.
I'm trying to get us to, it seems to me that if the last document that was reviewed and has staff comments in it is November 10th, that really should be where we started. Because no policy committee has actually either discussed and then reviewed, right? You have one policy committee receiving those staff comments, and now you have a new committee reviewing a policy that includes those comments. But I think in all transparency, we would want to see that original document as part of our original review as the policy committee.
So what you have before you tonight is based on the last policy committee suggestions, as Rachel shared. They wanted us to really distinguish the personal, for one example, personal versus the work technology. So are you asking for us to bring this committee those comments and show where we have revised it based on those comments?
Yes, because I feel like we're receiving something that has not had work done on it. And I know that's not true. And in terms of the context of where we started versus where we are today, being able to see those comments and what was deleted and, all of that, that's kind of how I typically work through the policy review process when I'm on this committee.
Okay, so you want us to bring back the policy with those markups?
Yes.
Can we capture those, Rachel?
Most of the markups that, so from the November 10th were things that were changing because we used a policy from a different district. And so we tweaked it to make sure that it was aligned to the roles within our district. So most of them were very minor, except for those pieces from one specific policy committee member in November, which are those handwritten notes that Lisa took. And that's where, when we came back to review it, we really went off those because those were the substantive pieces.
Right.
And those are things, those were really digging into situations where, if a parent brings their personal cell phone to a basketball game on a Saturday and uses our Wi-Fi, how does the policy relate to them then? That's where we started parsing out the guest. And previous to that, it had all been kind of lumped together. And so that's really that substantive piece of like separating out student versus staff versus guest, and on a personal device versus on on a district device.
And I guess if I can, just to make sure I'm understanding what we're looking at, basically we have the policy from November, and you had discussions and there were questions. And so then you refined the policy language. But those refinements that are currently included in the policy that we're looking at in today's agenda are not highlighted in different colored font.
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
that's what we need to have happen. I think in terms of, giving all three of us a better context of really what the train of conversation has been, and the work of our predecessors on this committee really kind of makes more sense.
Yeah.
Tony, what do you think?
If you feel that that is necessary, then I will go with that.
Okay.
I guess I trust, but anyway, whatever.
Okay, Sue, how about you?
Well, I definitely would like to have just a contrast and see what those changes were. I think that is the way I would personally want to review a policy. Since I wasn't there at that time, and those minute, the minute details on board book is not what this information, any changes this information has. So I would really appreciate that also.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah. That makes sense. I guess I misjudged it with thinking that we were kind of starting from with a new policy committee with kind of from here. So we can definitely go back and take a look at those. Yep.
And I think, well, I'll speak for myself. I won't speak for Tony or Sue, but I also want to be sensitive to the suggestions of all three of our predecessors on the committee, because and going and making changes, at least understanding if we're making a suggestion for change in the policy, that either that we are aware, either that it's existing policy language, or there was a suggestion made by a previous board member to make the change. And that it's nice to know exactly where it's coming from.
That makes sense, Abigail. I guess I was just thinking starting from what I'm dealing with now, but yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So I think given that we don't really have a whole lot to talk about today, I think we kind of need to start from scratch and, get those, get that, that document posted, and maybe we look at, Teresa, you and I can certainly look at the policies that I know there were quite a few that you had mentioned were coming forward next month. Maybe we talk about when we can get this one squeezed in as well. Is there any kind of timeline that you're working with, Rachel, in terms of getting this moved through for board approval?
I don't know if there's any deadline. There is, the AUP is one of those policies that is looked at annually because it does change. But again, this has been the existing 529 or 524, sorry, not 520, I'm thinking college savings, right? But no, the 524 policy is in place at this point. So there's no, we do have an AUP in place.
Okay. And that was reviewed in 18. So, but having that policy in place fulfills the requirements. Okay. All right. Tony, Sue, I'll leave it open to you if we want to start reviewing the policy as it is today, or if we want to wait until that other version comes forward for us to review and come back.
Well, I just have a question or comment. Is it that much critical difference if we just from 520?
Your internet is unstable, Tony. We couldn't hear the question.
Okay, say something again.
Okay.
Okay, now I can hear you. Okay. Did you guys hear me?
No.
Oh, I don't know why. Okay. Anyway, I was saying, is there that much critical difference from the 524 where we left off and the 624 or 34 that we're
There,
starting now?
yeah, there are significant changes when you compare them side by side.
Mhm.
There are many similarities, and I know, trying to track them myself between the new policy and the old policy
Mhm.
was really challenging. And then there also are some brand new sections
Okay.
that
Okay.
relate particularly to the maintenance of the district's website and, classroom websites. And Rachel mentioned the personal devices really weren't addressed at all in the old policy in the same way that is in the proposed new policy. So
Okay.
yeah, it's not simply stamp from one into the other.
So to be clear, are we asking for the policies changes from 524 to this, or just the policy changes that occurred since the last meeting in November?
We're looking for the mocked up document from the November meeting.
Okay.
Just so we can see what changes were added to the policy between November and what the document that's in the agenda today. Tony, Sue, does that work for both of you?
Yes.
All right, great. So I guess we'll call the meeting, and Teresa, you and I can connect on how we want to get this back into the queue.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot.